Hello, I'm Mikhail Johnson. As a pianist and composer, I have been privileged to experience the genesis of musical creation on two ends of the spectrum: the creation of a new work and the interpretation of a new or existing work. And what I've found to be quite intriguing is when I remove myself from the creation process and become the lowly audience member. I am sure many of you, as an audience member, can relate to how wide and varied a musician's interpretation of a piece of music can be as you move from one concert to the next. And yet, one can be mystified as to how one performance can be immaculately executed and yet seem quite boring, and in another performance, though it has its own set of shortcomings, can be utterly inspirational and electric. And it led me to ask these questions: why does this happen? What really is interpretation of music anyway? And is this idea something that is innate or something that any musician can strive for? How does one formulate a musical interpretation? And can this idea be conceived from a pedagogical standpoint? Well, stay tuned for answers to these questions and more. So, what is musical interpretation? Well, according to the Grove Music Online, they say it is a musical vernacular that refers to the understanding of a piece of music and has often been used to primarily signify the way in which notation should be interpreted. In other words, the rendering of a musical composition according to one's conception of the author's idea. So, speaking of one's conception of the author's idea, let's unpack the meaning behind this with an example of two pianists, Grigory Sokolov and Angela Hewitt, performing the opening gestures from the prelude of Ravel's Le Tombeau de Couperin. The work was written as an homage to the great French Baroque composer Francois Couperin. Listen to these two excerpts and let's take a look at what we can gather about their conception of the author's idea. So, as you can hear, there are two distinct takes on the gesture. Both are quite engaging, in my opinion, and both approach the work in different perspectives. What I received from Sokolov is this dreamy, evocative, water-like feel, a signature Ravalian sound, and yet still maintaining this dance-like underpinning reminiscent of Couperin in the Baroque style. From Hewitt, on the other hand, I received a more literal approach towards the style of Couperin, and in a broad sense, letting the writing of Ravel speak for itself. In both instances, quite intriguing and valid interpretations, and yet it's still their conception of the author's idea. In Paul Thom's book, The Musician as Interpreter, he implies that for musical interpretation to be successful, it must in some ways exceed the object. Because of this, interpretation involves creativity. The interpretation cannot simply reproduce the object, but it does represent the object. And because of this fact, interpretation requires fidelity to the object. So in other words, a genuine interpretation lies somewhere in the middle of two extremes: fidelity to the score and the need for creativity. Therefore, only fidelity to the score is basically mere repetition or literal transcription, which is not interpretation. And likewise, willfully departures from the object are not interpretation either. I will let Professor Anton Weinberg tell you in his own words this concept of musical interpretation.
What is interpretation? Well, remember back to your childhood. Remember you open your colouring book that your mother's bought you, and there on the first page is a black and white, just drawn in black ink, a picture of a castle in its own grounds with forest and lawns and flower beds, and then this castle just in the distance. Now it's up to you to colour this, and you can choose the colours. And you're not altering the structure of the painting, you don't move things around, so there's no fear about altering the structure of the music. But it is your creative decision. So is the grass green, or Has there been little rain this summer and it's been a very hot summer and the grass is now yellow? Or perhaps there's no grass at all because it's been really bad. And then the leaves on the trees, what colours are they? What kind of trees are they? And you go to the castle. Is it made of that rather dour, dark grey granite which Scottish castles are built from? Or is it that wonderful warm red stone that you find castles are built in Spain? It's your choice. Of course, you've got to do your homework. You can't have foliage surrounding the castle which may be from the upper Amazon and then a granite looking castle. That obviously doesn't work. But it is your creative choice what you're going to do.
Speaking of research, many people, including myself, have formulated musical interpretation through a variety of means. This could be by listening to their favorite recording or recordings of the work. A pianist may like the performance of one section from one record and the performance of another section from another record, and they would piece those ideas together. In another instance, one could see these recordings as an approved manifestation of their own ideas because it's executed by a professional musician of high standing. Otherwise, there's a fear of one's own ideas being incorrect or invalid. But Michael Krauss, in his collection of essays, The Interpretation of Music, he iterates, I shall argue that works of music by nature allows for a multiplicity of ideal admissible interpretations, and that he who requires that there must be a single right interpretation of musical scores as classically construed will do violence to musical interpretive practice. And so why do some interpretations become successful and others unsuccessful? Well, the great pianist Arthur Schnabel thinks if the performer became one with the music, the audience would feel it, while if one tried to play to an audience, he would not be able to do full justice to the music. In short, it all has to do with the intention and the connection one makes with the works they play. If one takes a recording of a valid interpretation and tries to reproduce everything in it, the tempi, articulation, etc., without any connection made to one's personal intention as to the developments and choices made in the recording, it leads to mere replication of the object, none of which represents the individuality of the interpreter. However, if internalized and it is in congruence with one's musical connection and intentions, then the realization thereof will not only become more potent, but will nevertheless produce fruits of individuality. Here, the pianist Jerome Lowenthal has an interesting perspective about this idea of individuality, specifically a comparison between the great composer's interpretation of their own work versus the interpretation of present-day musicians.
We have to be faithful to the score. But what that means, what the score means, that's a different question. Do we want to play a Beethoven sonata the way Beethoven would have played it? Do we want to play a Beethoven sonata the way Beethoven would have liked it played? The answer might seem to be obviously yes, and yet the more you think about it, the more you worry about it. And you've brought up this very interesting point. Nobody would dream of playing Rachmaninoff the way Rachmaninoff plays it. You see, who would play... I'm exaggerating a little bit, we play... Of course, Rachmaninoff doesn't play it that fast, but he plays it much similarly.
As you can see, this speaks volume that even in the hands of the composer, their musical interpretation still holds that medium between creativity and fidelity. So how are we able to teach this idea of musical interpretation? A very potent way to internalize and understand musical interpretation is through the Dalcroze method. In this method, the students will be required to be away from their instruments, and they will be asked to reproduce the music through their bodies, having the idea of what they would like to produce internalized through motion and through reaction to their musical intention. they will hear a recording of a piece they are working on, and away from their instrument, they will have to depict an interpretation of what is happening in the music, a reaction with their body of dynamics, articulation, pacing, etc., through gesture. Then the teacher can bring this further without the recording, indicating 3 different ways to interpret the same passage. Then the student will choose one to replicate in performance on their instrument, and the teacher can likewise depict through body motion the interpretation presented to see if it is in congruence with their decision. Another potent way to internalize and understand music interpretation is through the blind audition method. And this was a great tool discovered when I attended the Masterclass workshop curated by Professor William Westney of Texas Tech University. In this Masterclass, the student is asked to present attending a blind audition, and they have to perform the passage of music 3 times representing 3 different persons auditioning, vying for a spot to solo with orchestra. After their 3 performances, the audience chooses which one the judges would select. In a studio setting, this could be replicated through a recording of the performance and having the student choose the best one. These are excellent tools because it enforces the idea that the students are capable of formulating their own interpretations without any imposition from the teacher. Their musicianship and interpretation relies on their own creative powers. In conclusion, musical interpretation is something every performer can produce. This is a skill that is both innate and can be acquired. Pianist Jonathan Biss comments that it begins with the pieces that you feel closely connected to, so that you are confident enough to be spontaneous and that the decisions you make spontaneously will be true to the music. At least, personally, I don't find I'm free enough to take chances and try some things if I don't feel a profound connection to the music. So again, it goes beyond mere presentation of the art. It is about having something to say about your connection with the art. Arthur Schnabel remarks, "The pianist will only be able to perform his task if he makes music quite spontaneously. Or as Heine says, if the presentation reveals the performer standing on the same free spiritual heights as the composer, if it convinces us that he too is free." So I hope you enjoyed this brief overview in today's video on musical interpretation. And until next time, thanks for watching.